The document slid across the table with a soft whisper against the polished wood. My manager, Patricia Hayes, watched my face carefully as I picked it up, her expression neutral but expectant. "These are concerns that came up during your review preparation," she said evenly. "I wanted to give you a chance to respond before we finalize anything." I scanned the page, my stomach dropping with each line. Struggles with independent decision-making without guidance. Requires excessive oversight on routine tasks. Shows resistance to constructive feedback from senior team members. The words felt foreign, like reading someone else's performance review. None of these concerns had ever been mentioned to me directly. No warnings, no coaching conversations, no indication that anyone questioned my competence. My eyes moved to the bottom of the page where the source was cited, feedback compiled from direct supervisor observations and mentorship documentation. My mentor sat 2 chairs away, hands folded neatly on the table, eyes fixed on a point somewhere past my shoulder. They hadn't looked at me since I'd entered the room. That should have been my first clue. But shock made me slow to understand what was actually happening. Across the conference table, my mentor remained perfectly still. Their face showed polite attention, the expression of someone present for a routine meeting. No discomfort, no surprise, no indication that anything unusual was being discussed. Because it wasn't unusual to them. They'd written these concerns, or at least contributed to them substantially. The realization settled over me like cold water. This wasn't feedback I was meant to learn from. This was strategic sabotage, delivered with enough professional language to seem legitimate while being vague enough to be hard to refute. Struggles with independent decision-making could mean anything or nothing. Requires excessive oversight, was subjective interpretation, not measurable fact. I looked at my mentor, waiting for them to interject, to clarify, to defend me the way mentors were supposed to do. Their eyes stayed down, expression unchanged. They weren't going to help because they'd orchestrated this. The person who'd taught me everything, who I'd trusted completely, had quietly poisoned my review before I ever saw it. And they sat there now, watching it unfold with practiced neutrality, like a stranger observing someone else's crisis. I smiled. The expression felt strange on my face, muscles pulling in unfamiliar directions, but I held it steady. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," I said, my voice calm and professional. "I appreciate the feedback and the opportunity to address these concerns." Patricia looked slightly surprised, probably expecting defensiveness or emotion. My mentor's eyes finally flickered toward me, just for a second, registering my reaction. I saw something flash across their face. Relief, maybe. Or satisfaction. They'd expected me to fight, to get emotional, to prove the very criticisms they'd documented. Instead, I was thanking them. "I'd like some time to review these points more thoroughly and prepare a response," I continued evenly. "Would it be possible to schedule a follow-up discussion?" Patricia nodded slowly. "Of course. We can reconvene next week." I gathered the document carefully, folding it precisely along the creases. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't waver. Inside, something fundamental had cracked, but I refused to let it show. Because the moment I reacted emotionally, I'd confirm everything they'd written about me. So I smiled and nodded, and played the role of the grateful employee receiving constructive criticism. And I watched my mentor relax slightly, thinking they'd won. The hallway outside the conference room felt too bright, fluorescent lights harsh after the dimmer meeting space. I walked steadily toward my desk, maintaining composure despite the adrenaline making my hands want to tremble. Behind me, I heard quick footsteps. My mentor caught up, falling into step beside me with easy familiarity. "Hey, that meeting was rough," they said, their tone sympathetic and concerned. "I know performance reviews can be stressful. We should grab coffee later and talk through some of those points. I can help you develop a response strategy." The casual offer of help, delivered as if they hadn't been the source of the problem, was almost impressive in its audacity. They were maintaining the mentorship facade, positioning themselves as my supporter while simultaneously undermining me. "Thanks, but I think I need to process this on my own first," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "I appreciate the offer though." Their expression flickered, just slightly. Disappointment or concern, I couldn't tell which. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me. We're a team." "No," I thought. "We're not. We never were." But I just nodded and continued walking, putting distance between us with each step. We would not be talking later. We would not be developing strategies together. That door had closed the moment they'd chosen sabotage over support. My name is Molly Green, and 3 years ago, I'd been thrilled when offered a junior position on the marketing analytics team. The role came with a built-in mentor, someone senior who would guide my development, help me navigate corporate politics, teach me the unwritten rules. That mentor had been patient and knowledgeable, generous with their time and advice. They'd shown me how to structure presentations that caught executive attention, how to anticipate questions before meetings, how to build credibility with difficult stakeholders. I'd trusted them completely. When they'd suggested I take on extra projects to build my portfolio, I'd done it eagerly. When they'd offered to review my work before submission, I'd been grateful. When they'd recommended I let them handle certain client communications because I wasn't ready yet, I'd accepted their judgment. Looking back now, I could see the pattern I'd missed while living it. Every opportunity to shine had been filtered through them. Every success had been presented as our team effort, with their guidance being essential. Every piece of my work had passed through their hands before reaching anyone else. I'd thought they were protecting me, developing me carefully. Now I understood they'd been controlling my visibility, ensuring I remained dependent while they collected credit. The mentorship I'd valued was actually a carefully constructed cage. Sitting at my desk, I forced myself to think clearly instead of emotionally. The review document sat in front of me, words that could derail my career staring back accusingly. I needed to understand when this had started, how long they'd been building this narrative. I opened my email archive and began searching. The first instance appeared 6 months ago, subtle enough that I dismissed it at the time. My mentor had sent Patricia a project update, casually mentioning that I'd needed significant guidance on the client analysis. The analysis had been my work entirely, completed independently while my mentor was on vacation. But the email framed it as collaborative, with heavy mentorship involvement. 2 months later, another email to Patricia, Molly's improving, though she still requires regular check-ins to ensure quality standards. I'd never been told quality was an issue. My work had consistently met or exceeded targets. A month after that, copied to the entire management team, working closely with Molly to develop her strategic thinking skills. The pattern was clear and deliberate. Small comments, individually innocuous, collectively building a narrative that I was struggling, dependent, requiring constant oversight. None of it was true. All of it was documented and shared with decision-makers. This hadn't been sudden. This was systematic, methodical positioning. The timing crystallized as I dug deeper into company communications. 3 weeks ago, Patricia had sent a department-wide email about budget constraints and promotion freezes. Only critical roles would see advancement this year, she'd written. Performance reviews would carry extra weight in determining who stayed positioned for future opportunities. My mentor had sent their concerns to Patricia 2 days later. Right when reviews mattered most, when every evaluation would be scrutinized for promotion decisions, they'd submitted documentation painting me as a liability. The strategic timing was undeniable. If I was positioned as someone requiring excessive mentorship and struggling with independence, I wouldn't be considered for advancement. Meanwhile, my mentor could claim they were managing a difficult team member, demonstrating their leadership capabilities. They were clearing the path for their own promotion by pushing me down. The stakes had seemed abstract during the review meeting, just uncomfortable feedback to address. Now I understood this was about my entire career trajectory. One bad review during a promotion cycle could shadow me for years. It could determine whether I was seen as high potential or high maintenance. And my mentor had calculated exactly when to strike for maximum damage. The betrayal felt personal, but the execution was purely professional. Coldly strategic. I could have stormed into Patricia's office demanding to defend myself. Could have requested an immediate meeting to refute every claim point by point. Could have confronted my mentor directly, forcing them to explain their actions. Every instinct screamed to fight back immediately, to correct the record before it became permanent. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of my mentor's satisfied expression when I'd stayed calm in the review. They'd expected emotion, defensiveness, the very behavior that would validate their concerns about me. Fighting loudly would play into their narrative. So instead, I made a different choice. I would document. Quietly, methodically, without drama or confrontation. I would let the process continue while building an undeniable record of truth. Not opinions or interpretations, just facts with timestamps. Because the thing about lies, even strategic professional ones, is that they eventually contradict themselves. They require perfect consistency, perfect timing, perfect control of information. And I was betting my mentor hadn't been quite perfect enough. I opened a new folder on my personal drive and began compiling. Every project I'd completed independently. Every client communication I'd handled without oversight. Every success that had been reframed as collaborative effort. The truth was boring, unsexy, just timestamps and email trails. But sometimes boring evidence was the most lethal kind. My work emails told a different story than my mentor's narrative. Project completion confirmations sent directly to clients, with no mentor oversight. Thank you notes from stakeholders praising my independent analysis. Meeting invitations where I'd been specifically requested to present findings. All time-stamped, all verifiable, all contradicting the image of someone who couldn't function without constant guidance. I compiled spreadsheets showing project timelines. Of the 15 major projects I'd worked on this year, 11 had been completed while my mentor was traveling, on vacation, or assigned to other priorities. I delivered all 11 on time, meeting quality standards without the excessive oversight they claimed was necessary. I downloaded drafts from our shared drive, comparing original versions to final submissions. My initial work rarely changed substantially after their review. The significant guidance they referenced in emails typically amounted to minor formatting adjustments or suggestions I'd already incorporated before they saw the files. Every piece of evidence was dry, factual, undramatic. Not accusations or emotional appeals, just documentation proving I'd been functioning independently and successfully for months while they'd been telling management otherwise. I organized it chronologically, created a simple index, backed everything up in 3 locations. Then I waited. Because I'd learned something important from watching my mentor operate, timing mattered as much as truth. HR's email arrived Wednesday morning, 3 days after the review meeting. Hi Molly, we'd like to schedule a follow-up conversation regarding your performance review. This is standard process for reviews flagged for additional discussion. Please let us know your availability this week. Best, Kendra Sullivan, HR business partner. Standard process. The phrase was carefully neutral, revealing nothing about whether this was routine or significant. I responded professionally, offering several time slots. Kendra scheduled Thursday afternoon. The meeting location was listed as a small conference room on the 3rd floor, away from my department. Private. As I confirmed attendance, I wondered if my mentor had received a similar email. Were they being asked for clarification on their feedback? Or was I the only one being questioned further? The uncertainty was deliberate, I realized. HR was gathering information without revealing their angle. They wanted authentic responses, not carefully prepared defenses. I decided not to bring my documentation to this first meeting. Let them ask their questions. Let me understand what they already knew and what gaps existed. Going in armed with evidence might seem aggressive or defensive. Better to appear cooperative, responsive, open. I could always provide documentation later if needed. The hardest part was not knowing if this was routine scrutiny or the beginning of something larger. But I'd committed to the quiet approach. So I waited, and I didn't ask questions I couldn't ask without revealing anxiety. My mentor seemed relaxed that week, joking easily with colleagues at lunch, stopping by my desk with friendly small talk. How's the review response coming? They asked Thursday morning, their tone casual and supportive. Need any help thinking through your development plan? The continued performance of mentorship was almost admirable. They genuinely seemed to believe I'd simply accept the feedback and move on, grateful for their continued guidance despite their betrayal. I'm working through it, I replied neutrally. Probably overthinking it, honestly. They laughed, sympathetic. You definitely tend to overthink. That's actually something we could work on together, learning to trust your instincts more. The subtle reinforcement of the needs guidance narrative, delivered as friendly advice. They couldn't help themselves. Even in casual conversation, they positioned themselves as the experienced voice directing my development. I'll keep that in mind, I said, turning back to my computer. They lingered a moment, perhaps expecting more engagement, then moved on. I watched them go, noticing the confidence in their posture. They thought this was over. The review was submitted, the damage done, and I'd accepted it quietly like they'd predicted. They had no idea HR was asking questions. Or maybe they did know and weren't worried. Maybe they'd faced questions before about other ments and successfully defended their version of events. That thought sent a chill through me. What if this wasn't their first time? Kendra Sullivan was younger than I'd expected, probably early 30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She greeted me warmly, offered coffee, and settled across the small conference table with a tablet and notepad. "Thanks for making time, Molly. I wanted to discuss some aspects of your performance review to make sure we have complete understanding of the feedback." She pulled up the document on her tablet. "These concerns that were raised, when were you first made aware of these performance issues?" It was a careful question, asking about awareness without asking about validity. "During the review meeting on Monday," I replied honestly. That was the first time I'd seen those specific concerns documented. Kendra made a note. "And prior to Monday, had you received verbal feedback from your mentor or manager about these areas? Informal coaching or correction?" "No," I said simply. I'd never been told there were concerns about my independence or decision-making. Another note. "That's interesting. Generally, feedback in reviews should reflect ongoing conversations, not new information." She looked up. "Can you walk me through your typical working relationship with your mentor? How much oversight do they typically provide on your projects?" I described our dynamic carefully, factually. How most of my work was independent. How they reviewed finals before submission but rarely made substantial changes. How I'd successfully managed projects when they were unavailable. Kendra listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Where did certain claims in the review come from, she wanted to know. Not why were they wrong. Just where. "I've never seen those concerns before," I said carefully when Kendra asked about a specific claim that I struggled with client communication. "I've been handling client meetings independently for 6 months." Kendra leaned forward slightly. "Do you have documentation of those client interactions?" "Yes," I replied. "Meeting confirmations, follow-up emails, client feedback. All in my work email." "Would you be comfortable sharing access to those communications? Just for verification purposes?" She asked it casually, but I understood the significance. HR was fact-checking. "Of course," I agreed. "I can forward relevant emails or provide access to folders. Whatever's helpful." Kendra made another note, then asked several more questions about specific projects mentioned in the review. Each time, she asked where feedback had come from, when I'd received it, how issues had been addressed. Her questions were precise, systematic, building a timeline I recognized. She was comparing my account to whatever documentation existed, looking for inconsistencies, contradictions, gaps in the narrative. "One more question," Kendra said as our meeting approached the hour mark. "In your experience, has your mentor's feedback to you directly matched what they've communicated to management about your performance?" It was the most direct question yet, asking me to identify the disconnect. "Not always," I answered honestly. Sometimes they've presented collaborative work as heavily mentored when I'd actually completed it independently. Kendra's expression didn't change, but she held my gaze a moment longer. Then she nodded and closed her tablet. "Thank you, Molly. This has been very helpful." The comparison must have been damning. Over the next week, I noticed subtle shifts in how people interacted with me. Patricia's emails became slightly warmer, less formal. A senior director I'd worked with on a client project stopped by to ask my opinion on a new proposal, something that hadn't happened before. My mentor remained friendly but seemed slightly distracted, checking their phone more frequently, disappearing for unexplained meetings. I didn't ask questions or draw attention to the changes. Just continued working, documenting, maintaining the same professional demeanor I'd shown since the review. Then on Friday afternoon, I saw my mentor's calendar block out 2 hours with a simple notation, HR meeting Kendra. No other details, but the timing and participant told me everything I needed to know. They were being asked to clarify their documentation, to explain the discrepancies between their narrative and verifiable records, to defend claims that didn't match time-stamped evidence. I wondered if they were nervous. If they'd prepared carefully for this meeting the way they'd presumably prepared for mine. Or if they still believed their version of events would be accepted without question, that their seniority and experience would carry more weight than my timestamps. Either way, I wasn't invited to their meeting. This was between them and HR. I was simply the subject under discussion. The reversal of position was striking. A week ago, I'd sat in a conference room defending my competence. Now my mentor was doing the same, except they had to defend not their work but their honesty. The timeline discrepancies must have been impossible to explain away. How could someone require constant oversight on projects completed while their mentor was out of the country? How could feedback about performance issues surface weeks before a critical review cycle rather than when problems allegedly occurred? How could excessive guidance be documented in emails when project completion records showed independent work? Dates were stubborn things. They couldn't be reinterpreted or reframed like subjective performance assessments. Either my mentor had been actively involved in projects or they hadn't. Either they'd raised concerns in real time or they'd compiled them retroactively. The evidence would show which was true. I imagined Kendra walking through the timeline systematically, asking my mentor to explain specific emails, specific claims, specific gaps between when issues allegedly occurred and when they were documented. Watching them try to reconcile contradictions that couldn't be reconciled. The meeting lasted the full 2 hours. When my mentor finally emerged, their expression was carefully neutral, but their usual easy confidence had dimmed. They went straight to their desk, declining a colleague's lunch invitation with a brief excuse. I didn't approach them. Didn't ask how it went. Just noted the change and continued working. Because the thing about strategic sabotage is that it requires plausible deniability. Once the denials become implausible, the strategy collapses under its own weight. Monday brought another email from HR, this time sent to my mentor and copied to Patricia. I saw it only because my mentor's screen was visible as I passed their desk, and they hadn't minimized it quickly enough. Thank you for meeting with us last week. We have a few follow-up questions regarding the documentation timeline for Molly's review. Please schedule time this week to clarify some inconsistencies we've identified. Inconsistencies. The corporate euphemism for contradictions that couldn't be explained. My mentor's jaw was tight as they read, fingers moving quickly to close the email before others could see. They hadn't expected follow-up questions. Probably thought one meeting would be sufficient to clarify their feedback and move on. Instead, HR was pressing harder, finding gaps in their story that needed explaining. I continued to my desk, processing the implications. This wasn't routine review process anymore. This was an investigation, informal but real. HR had found something wrong enough to require additional scrutiny. Whether that would result in consequences for my mentor or just adjustments to my review, I didn't know. But the fact that they were being questioned at all represented a fundamental shift. The person who'd positioned themselves as my evaluator was now being evaluated themselves. And apparently, they weren't passing as easily as they'd expected. Patricia's demeanor toward me changed noticeably. Where she'd been coolly professional during the review meeting, she now engaged more directly. Asked my opinion on strategy decisions. Invited me to client calls I'd previously been excluded from. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. She was reconsidering her assessment of my capabilities, viewing me through a different lens than the one my mentor had provided. During a team meeting, Patricia asked me to present analysis I'd completed independently. Molly's been doing excellent work on client segmentation, she said, her tone carrying more warmth than usual. I'd like her to walk us through the findings. My mentor's expression flickered briefly before settling back into neutral. They were losing control of the narrative they'd carefully constructed. I presented clearly and confidently, answering questions without hesitation. The work spoke for itself, requiring no defense or justification. Several colleagues nodded approvingly. One asked to see my methodology for their own project. After the meeting, Patricia pulled me aside briefly. That was strong work. I want to discuss expanding your project portfolio soon. Her tone was slightly apologetic, though she didn't explicitly acknowledge the review situation. Just shifted her treatment of me in ways that signaled she was rethinking previous conclusions. The validation felt good, but I remained cautious. One positive meeting didn't erase a negative review. I still needed that document corrected officially, not just socially rehabilitated through better treatment. The call came Thursday afternoon. "Hi Molly, this is Kendra from HR. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Her voice was professional, but carried an edge of something I couldn't quite identify. "Of course," I replied, stepping into an empty conference room for privacy. "I wanted to give you an update on the review situation. We've completed our assessment and have some questions about your mentor's professional conduct." The phrasing made my pulse quicken. Not questions about my performance anymore. Questions about their conduct. During our investigation, we identified patterns in how feedback was documented and communicated that raised concerns. Specifically, the timing and framing of performance issues that weren't addressed in real time. Kendra paused. "Can I ask if you've experienced other instances where your mentor took credit for your work or positioned collaborative projects as heavily mentored when you'd worked independently?" She was asking if there was a pattern beyond what she'd already found, giving me permission to share experiences I'd minimized or explained away. "Yes," I said carefully. "There have been several instances over the past year where my contributions were reframed in communications to management." "Can you provide specific examples?" I walked through the email trail I'd compiled. Projects presented as collaborative when I'd worked alone. Successes attributed to mentorship guidance that hadn't occurred. My independent work consistently repositioned to emphasize their involvement. Kendra listened quietly, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. Then, "You're not the first person to report similar experiences." The revelation that I wasn't the first hit harder than expected. "There have been other ments?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can't discuss specific details about other employees," Kendra replied carefully. "But I can tell you that similar patterns were identified in previous mentorship relationships. The concerns weren't pursued formally at the time, but they've been documented." So this was their established pattern. Taking credit, building narratives about struggling ments who needed constant guidance, positioning themselves as the indispensable leader managing difficult team members. And it had worked before. Previous ments had probably either left the company or simply accepted the diminished positioning without fighting back. I was just the first who'd stayed quiet in a way that prompted HR to look closer. "What happens now?" I asked. "We're addressing the conduct issues through formal channels," Kendra said. "I can't share details about disciplinary processes, but I want you to know this is being taken seriously." She paused. "Regarding your review, we're recommending significant amendments based on documentation that contradicts the concerns that were raised. Patricia will be scheduling time to discuss the corrections with you." Corrections. My review would be formally amended, the false narrative replaced with accurate assessment. The relief was overwhelming, though I kept my voice professional. "Thank you for taking the time to investigate thoroughly." "Thank you for providing clear documentation," Kendra replied. "It made our assessment much more straightforward." The closed-door meeting happened Friday afternoon. I only knew because my mentor's calendar showed a 2-hour block simply labeled HR Confidential, and they left the office looking tense, carrying a folder I recognized as standard disciplinary documentation. They'd been called in alone. No witnesses, no supporters, just them and whatever evidence HR had compiled from multiple sources. The conversations I'd had, the emails I'd provided, the timeline inconsistencies they couldn't explain, and apparently complaints from previous ments who documented similar experiences. I imagined the meeting playing out. Kendra laying out the pattern systematically. The credit-taking, the false narratives about struggling ments, the strategic timing of negative feedback. Evidence that couldn't be dismissed as miscommunication or different perspectives. My mentor had probably tried to defend themselves. Explained their feedback as legitimate coaching concerns. Framed their emails as appropriate documentation of mentorship challenges. Positioned themselves as a dedicated leader trying to develop difficult employees. But the timestamps and email trails told a different story. One that showed calculation rather than coaching. Strategic positioning rather than honest assessment. A pattern repeated across multiple ments that revealed intention rather than misunderstanding. When they returned to their desk 90 minutes later, their usual confidence had completely evaporated. They packed up quickly, avoiding eye contact with everyone, and left early without explanation. The office felt different in their absence. Lighter somehow. The official notification came Monday morning via company-wide email from the HR director. Brief, corporate, carefully worded to avoid legal implications while signaling significant change. Effective immediately, the formal mentorship program is being restructured to include enhanced oversight and documentation requirements. All current mentorship assignments are being reviewed. Employees with concerns about mentorship relationships should contact HR directly. No names mentioned, but everyone in our department understood the subtext. My mentor's unchecked authority over Ments was ending. The program they'd operated within and exploited was being fundamentally changed. By midweek, I heard through office channels that they'd been removed from all mentorship responsibilities. Quietly, without announcement, but definitively. They remained employed but in a significantly reduced capacity, no longer managing or developing junior staff. The loss of that role stripped away much of their power and visibility in the organization. They'd built their reputation on being an exceptional mentor, someone who developed talent and managed challenging employees effectively. Without that positioning, they were just another mid-level employee with adequate technical skills but diminishing relevance. I felt no satisfaction in their reduction. Just a quiet sense that justice had been served through process rather than confrontation. They tried to eliminate a threat to their advancement by sabotaging my review. Instead, they triggered an investigation that exposed their entire pattern of exploitation. The consequence fit the betrayal perfectly. Patricia scheduled our meeting Thursday morning. "I want to apologize," she began, unusual directness replacing her typical corporate diplomacy. "I accepted feedback about your performance without sufficient verification. That was a failure on my part." She pulled out a revised review document. "HR worked with me to amend your evaluation based on actual project documentation and verified outcomes. This is your corrected review." I scanned the new version. The vague criticisms had been replaced with specific accomplishments. "Demonstrates strong independent decision-making and initiative. Successfully manages complex projects with minimal oversight. Consistently delivers high-quality work ahead of deadlines." The contrast with the original was striking. "This reflects your actual performance," Patricia continued. "The previous version was based on incomplete and frankly misleading information. I should have caught that before it became part of your official record." She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. "I also want you to know that the issues with your mentorship relationship have been addressed. You'll be assigned a new mentor from a different department, someone with no connection to your current team dynamics. A fresh start with someone who had no incentive to sabotage me. Additionally," Patricia added, "we're moving forward with the promotion track we'd frozen. Based on your corrected review and the projects you've completed, I'm recommending you for advancement in the next cycle." The promotion I'd thought was lost because of strategic sabotage was back on the table. Officially, with documentation supporting it. The offer came formally 2 weeks later. Senior analyst position, significant salary increase, expanded responsibilities, and most importantly, direct reporting to Patricia rather than through my former mentor. "I want to be clear about what this role involves," Patricia explained during our discussion. "You'll be leading projects independently, managing client relationships directly, and mentoring junior analysts yourself eventually. The independence that was questioned in your original review is actually a requirement for this position." She looked at me seriously. "After everything that happened, I'd understand if you're hesitant about staying with the company. You were failed by people who should have supported you. If you want to explore external opportunities, I won't blame you." I'd considered that option. Other companies, fresh starts, places where I wouldn't carry the memory of betrayal. But leaving felt like letting them win. Like validating their attempt to push me out by actually leaving. "I'd like to accept the position," I said, "with some conditions." Patricia nodded, unsurprised. "I'm listening." "Clear documentation of expectations and evaluation criteria. Regular check-ins with measurable goals. And if I'm eventually assigned Ments, I want training on appropriate mentorship practices and oversight to ensure I'm actually supporting them, not exploiting them." The last point carried weight from recent experience. I never wanted to become what my mentor had been. Patricia agreed to all conditions. "We're implementing those practices department-wide. What happened with you was unacceptable, and we're making structural changes to prevent it from recurring." I accepted the offer that afternoon. Signed paperwork, confirmed start date, began transitioning to my new role. My former mentor cleared their desk 3 weeks later. No announcement, no farewell lunch, just a quiet departure on a Friday afternoon. They packed boxes while most of the department was in meetings, carried them to their car in multiple trips, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. I watched from my new office, feeling complicated emotions I couldn't quite name. Relief that they were gone. Regret that it had ended this way. Clarity that their departure was necessary for both of us to move forward. They tried to eliminate competition by destroying my credibility. Instead, they destroyed their own career trajectory through documented dishonesty. The justice was clean, bureaucratic, achieved through HR processes rather than dramatic confrontation. Exactly as I'd planned when I'd chosen silence over immediate defense. They never looked toward my office as they left. Never acknowledged me at all. Perhaps they blamed me for their downfall, though I'd simply documented truth and answered questions honestly. Or perhaps they understood, finally, that they'd done this to themselves. The elevator doors closed behind them, and they were gone. Several colleagues approached me later, awkwardly offering comments about the situation. I kept my responses brief and professional. No triumphant declarations, no detailed explanations. Just acknowledgement that things had changed and we were moving forward. Because the story wasn't really about them anymore. It was about what I'd learned and where I was going. 6 months into my new role, I mentored my first junior analyst. A bright recent graduate who reminded me uncomfortably of my younger self, eager and trusting. "I really appreciate you taking time to work with me," they said after our first meeting. "I know mentorship is extra work on top of your projects." "It's not extra work," I replied honestly. "It's part of my job, and something I take seriously." I'd thought carefully about what kind of mentor I wanted to be. Not someone who built dependency to make themselves indispensable. Not someone who took credit for others' development. Someone who actually taught, documented honestly, and stepped back to let men succeed independently. During team meetings, I made sure to credit my mentees' contributions specifically. When they completed projects successfully, I sent emails to leadership highlighting their work without inserting myself into the narrative. When they struggled, I coached privately and documented areas for improvement in real time, not retroactively before reviews. It was exhausting, being the mentor I'd needed instead of the one I'd had. But it was also clarifying. Every interaction was a choice to break the pattern, to prove that mentorship could be genuine support instead of strategic exploitation. Walking past the conference room where my review had happened, I felt no fear of exclusion or sabotage anymore. Just clarity about who I was and what I valued. Not everyone who teaches you wants you to succeed. Some people mentor to maintain dominance, not develop talent. The smartest response isn't always fighting back loudly. Sometimes it's staying quiet, documenting carefully, and letting truth do the damage your words never could. The silent approach had worked. My former mentor was gone. I was promoted and thriving. And the system that enabled their exploitation had been reformed. Justice achieved through process, patience, and meticulous record-keeping. The most boring kind of victory. And somehow the most satisfying.